My name's Gary Ashford. I'm the President of the Chartered Institute of Tax. On behalf of the CIOT and our partners, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, I'd like you to welcome to this afternoon's debate, looking at some of the tax and public finance challenges that an incoming Labour government would face, and perhaps identifying a few opportunities too. Now, James Murray, many of you probably recognise James. You know, we've got a great panel today, but James has literally only got about 25 minutes with us today, and so therefore we're going to sort of rush through slightly some of the introductions to make sure we sort of maximise our time with the Shadow FST. But we still want to sort of almost like make some introductions. So, you know, we are going to go quite quickly through those introductions so that we get to like questions and then we can sort of open up the debate anyway, sort of thing. So if Paul, we've got Paul Johnson here from the Institute of Fiscal Studies. You know, many of you have recognised Paul from TV. You know, it seems he's almost on every TV programme I see at the moment. So I think it's a very recognisable face. He's the Director of Policy at the Institute of Fiscal Studies. I'm very pleased to have my colleague Ellen Milner here, who is effectively the Director of Public Policy for the CIOT, and formerly was Deputy Director of the Large Business Office at HMRC, and obviously, you know, we're delighted and very lucky to have James Murray, you know, MP, who is going to, give us a bit of his intake on where we are in the world, and then we're going to open this out. So, but in terms of sort of almost getting this thing up and running, Paul Johnson, if you want to just give us 5 minutes, really, of you know, your thoughts and everything at the moment.
Okay, I'll speak very briefly if you want to know more. Apparently this is on Rachel Reeves's bedside table, so do go and buy Follow the Money, which will tell you everything I think about pretty much everything. Look, the public finance challenge, it's pretty hard to overstate the difficult situation the next government will inherit. Debt interest spending is its highest level for generations. Debt is at its highest level for generations. The tax take is already at its highest level pretty much ever. Growth is looking pretty poor. So lots of good cheer from me. That really does leave some quite difficult choices ahead. If you look at the current government's fiscal plans, it only manages to meet the sorts of fiscal rules that I think the Labour Party is also going to accept by having some very, very tight spending plans penciled in for after the next election. So part of the answer there might be, is there room for additional tax, or is there room for spending cuts? Well, on the second of those, I find that very hard to see unless there are some very remarkable decisions taken. Just take one single thing. The biggest fiscal announcement of the last year, arguably of the last Parliament, was made this summer. It was called the NHS Workforce Plan. That by itself will raise spending as a fraction of national income, and therefore tax as a fraction of national income, by 2 percentage points. That's a £50 billion tax increase over the next decade, just to fund the NHS Workforce Plan. The way we've managed to fund that sort of thing in the past, cutting defence spending, having a decade of austerity for everything else, is not a trick we can play again. So I think the flexibility is much more likely to be on the tax side. Is there space to increase tax? Yes. We raise quite a lot less than most of our Western European counterparts. There are big reforms that need to happen to capital gains tax, inheritance tax, council tax, all of those things you can get a few billion from, make them both more efficient and more equitable. We can run through some specifics there if people would like. But if we're looking at several percentage points of national income, then we are probably looking at some elements of income tax, national insurance and VAT, which between them raise 2/3 of all of the tax revenue that we have. One thing I will give a quick shout out to is fuel duty. We're getting about 1.5% less of national income in tax from driving cars than we were 20 years ago. That will go down to 0 over the next 30 years under current policy because we're moving to electric cars and there is no tax on those. a government sometime soon is going to have to grasp that nettle and either charge for the electricity that goes into them or per mile driven. Politically difficult, I know, but we're going to have to do that. Last couple of words. You will have heard, quite rightly, a lot about growth today. That's what Rachel Reeves's speech was focused on. Of course, growth is important, and I do believe that governments can make a difference to growth. They can make a difference by doing some of the things that you heard about, planning reform. Politically difficult to make a difference, but it's important. Investment in high-quality public infrastructure, a better education system, a reformed tax system, and probably most importantly of all, a consistent, stable, sensible government and policy over a period of time in all of those areas, something we've been lacking for quite some considerable period. And of course, closer trading relationships with the European Union. All of those things will, over a period of time, be good for growth, but in an uncertain way, and in a way which helps in 5 or 10 years' time. You cannot and should not try to get growth dramatically quicker in year 1 or year 2 of a parliament. Governments are seriously powerful in this stuff, but they are powerful in the long run, and if they try to be too powerful in the short run, then they risk stoking nasty things like inflation and boom and bust and the sorts of things that we thought we'd got rid of 15 years ago. I could go on, but I will stop there to give particularly James plenty of time.
Thank you, Paul. Ellen, would you like to give us some of your thoughts?
Thanks very much, Paul and Gary. So good afternoon, everyone. So we need more money. It's not going to be an easy task. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes saying that actually one approach we could take to this would be to actually prioritise our tax administration and compliance system a little bit better. So traditionally, as Paul, a lot of things Paul have referenced around tax headlines, they are focusing on tax rates, the threshold that people pay at, deterrence and promotions of types of behaviour, so creative industries, or, you know, I was thinking this morning, some of you might have needed a can of Coke to come in here this afternoon to get yourself through. Those of you who took a Diet Coke break will have paid less for the privilege. But while inevitably there's a value to all of these things, I would question whether we're going to get our whole pot of gold that we need to sort out this problem from them. So I think many have limited appetite for tax increases. They like the idea of other people having tax increases, but less so themselves. And at some point, we may reach the tipping point whereby the incentives to avoid are going to outweigh the sort of risk of getting caught. So speaking from my time as a policy advisor at HMRC for quite a long time, there's clearly a place for kind of targeting policies on those who can afford to pay them, and those who actually giving incentives to those who could genuinely drive economic growth. But it's really, really difficult to get that targeting right. They can end up being super costly, and in order to make them attractive to investors, then they are going to be expensive, but then it also makes them very attractive to abusers. So you take things like where we've got to with research and development at the moment, where HMRC reckon in 2020, 2021, there was £1.13 billion worth of error and fraud just from the way the reliefs was working. So I'd argue that this kind of traditional approach might not get us over the line. But where could we look for perhaps a bigger uplift in that amount of money? And I wanted to focus in on the tax gap. So for those of you who don't spend every day living and breathing tax, this is the amount which is the difference between the theoretical amount of receipts that you should come in and actually what we get in practice. So in 2021-2022, the UK had a tax gap slightly north of how much Elon Musk paid for Twitter, or X if you like the change. That's £35.8 billion. So if we could try and get to a point where we close that money, can we pull into that pot, draw down on it a little bit more? So a lot has been done. A big success story of the last 15 years was reducing avoidance to a third of what it used to be. But actually, when you look at the numbers, about 45% of the tax gap comes from failure to take reasonable care and error. So this is people that are just simply not getting things right. So what is driving that? Now, there there are three things that I think we could do to try and look into that. So this is a £16 billion pot, by the way, of those two areas within the tax gap. And there are three things that we keep talking about in tax administration: simplification, digitalisation, and HMRC customer service levels. All of those things provide avenues to help people get things right, and therefore you could start reducing those amounts of money. At the moment, they're not delivering what they need to do. The tax system gets more complicated. The guidance isn't there to help us, people actually find out the answers that they need. The digitalisation programme is not yet getting us to a point where it's compliance by design. It should be making it harder for people to get things wrong, not easier to get things wrong. And then when we come down to customer service levels, people can't get through on the phone. So I picked an example. We ran a survey over the summer. People were telling us about trying to pay VAT. They wanted to pay VAT. They couldn't, because every time they had tried to apply, their registration got rejected by the system. So there's actually money that we're wanting to come in, and people want to make come in, but we can't collect it at the moment. So I think what we need to do is to make it so we get to a point where we are a more attractive tax administration system for people coming in from outside world, so remove the blockers there, but also can we actually get back to a point where people can spend the extra time they've got doing business and generating profit to close the deficit that we have for the money that we need, as well as the direct impact of bringing the money in from closing the tax gap. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ellen. Now, James, in 12 months' time, or around about 12 months' time, you may be coming into power. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on some of Paul's comments, Ellen's comments, and just some of your general comments, please.
Thank you. No, thanks very much. I think I'm not alone in the Labour front bench in not having a drop of complacency about where we are in the polls. I think being ahead in the polls, doing well in by-elections is obviously encouraging, but we take it incredibly seriously not to take anything for granted and keep working for it. And I think you'll hear that from me and every other Labour front bencher. But obviously I hope you all got to hear Rachel's speech earlier today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did and really thought it set out a fantastic vision, and actually what a fantastic Chancellor Rachel would make if we do win the next general election. And there's a lot I could talk about, obviously, in Rachel's speech, but I'll focus very much on tax and growth as they relate to some of the conversations that we've just been having now. Paul, it is right to say that growth is front and centre when we talk about what would be our mission in government. We set out our 5 missions, and it's not by accident that the number 1 mission is to get the highest sustained growth in the G7. We see that growth as being absolutely crucial to unlocking everything else that we'd want to do in government, and making people across the UK better off. But I think one aspect of Rachel's speech today, which bears repeating, is around what the actual mechanisms are by which we can encourage growth, by which we can get businesses to grow, by which we can encourage private sector investment, encourage all that competition and wealth creation to make people across Britain better off and get our economy on a better footing. And a couple of things which I just wanted to point out, you will have heard earlier in Rachel's speech. Firstly, Rachel talked about business rates and their impact on the high street. And we all know the impact that recent COVID and so on have had on our high streets, and they've been struggling for some time. Having a reform to business rates, scrapping the current system and replacing it with a better system for the 21st century, shifting the burden away from high streets and so on, would really help to encourage that economic vitality in the hearts of every community across the country. So that focus on high streets and reforming business rates and business rates taxation was a really important part of how we see economic growth as being driven across the country. I think the other bit as well that I think is so important, and it doesn't cost anything, but it's giving that certainty and stability about what is happening with taxes that businesses face. And that's why Rachel announced a while ago, but it's very relevant in the current context, our plans to put in place a roadmap for business taxation over the next Parliament if we won the general election. And that would set out for businesses the roadmap of how we would expect taxes to go in that Parliament. And the real advantage to doing that is that when you're asking businesses to make critical investment decisions in the UK, if they have certainty and stability and predictability in a plan, that in itself doesn't cost anything, giving that certainty and stability, but it can reap immense rewards in terms of business investment and the growth that comes from that. Now, just taking a step back briefly before we open up to questions, you know, Paul rightly pointed out the tax burden in this country is at its highest in 70 years. We've had 25 tax rises in this Parliament alone. And I think it's really important to keep repeating something that Keir said earlier in the week, which is that the route out of the 13 years of economic failure that we've seen under the Conservatives is not by pulling the tax and spend lever, it's by pulling the growth lever. And that is a really critical comment and a really critical observation to underline when we're talking about what a Labour government would do and how we would approach some of the big challenges that we face. You know, it is about going for growth, it is about wealth creation must come before wealth distribution, and we see that as being absolutely critical to how we would manage the economy, how we would get growth back into the economy, and how we'd make people across the UK better off. So just to conclude, you know, there's a lot I could talk about in terms of growth, and maybe I'll pick up some of the points in the questions when they come up. But if we have that stability and certainty, if we work hand in hand with businesses using targeted public sector support to encourage that private sector investment and growth, and if we really focus on security, both for the economy at large and for individual households, then we can start to move our economy and our country into a better place.
Thank you, James. We are now going to sort of open up to questions. As I've said earlier on, and James is only with us for a limited time in the first instance, so we'll try and keep our focus on the questions in the immediate term to questions almost for James, and then we can open it out. I can see some hands, and I'll take those in a second. George, do we have a microphone? Has Chris got the microphone? What we'll try and do is, because I think it was only the one microphone, so we'll try and keep the questions all in the round about the same area, but don't worry, I will sort of head across to whoever I'm looking at. So if we start with the gentleman here, just next to you, Chris, if we start with that, and we'll come to that lady next.
So Andy Abrahams, I'm the elected mayor at Mansfield, and regeneration of the high streets is a very important thing for us. So my question is about taxing the digital world, the big ones like Amazon and everyone who's got a digital presence that's moved off the high streets. How can we actually do that in practice, and can we incentivize it in a way that if they decide to have a presence on the high street, they then kind of avoid the tax or pay less, but also the ones that don't pay their taxes in this country, how can we actually, you know, get them to join in with the mission?
Thank you. James, do you want to respond to that, first of all?
Do you want to take a few, and then I can...
Oh, okay, sorry, if we could do the ladies one then, second of all.
Hi, it's Bex Bailey, BBC News. Paul Johnson said just now that an incoming government cannot or should not try to get growth dramatically quicker in the first year of a parliament. Keir Starmer said on Sunday that he would try and get growth dramatically quicker within the first few months of a parliament. Would you be worried that a Labour government would stoke inflation in that scenario?
Did you hear that? Okay. Yeah, okay. And is there another one do you want to go to this gentleman here, Chris?
James Davis, I'm an employment lawyer. I can understand not wanting to increase taxes and going for growth, but don't you think there's a role in reconsidering some of the tax thresholds and rates in order to address some of the wealth and income inequalities that have arisen under the past 13 years of Conservative governments?
And I think there was this gentleman here, actually. Is that enough? Or do you want to go after this one?
Yeah. Dominic Parrick, Lewisham, Deptford. I had a question about personal income taxes. We've ended up in the situation where marginal tax rates are sort of all over the place as you go up the income scale, and people worry about that a lot. Maybe potentially don't take promotions. They're worried about losing childcare benefits or paying these really high tax rates. Do you see scope for an incoming Labour government to look at reforming that?
Okay, I think we'll sort of let the panel sort of respond to that bank of questions, but don't worry, the people who haven't been heard, we will definitely pick up your questions. James, you want to kick off?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of the last two questions were kind of in addressing the point that the tax burden, well, addressing the point I think that I made around the tax burden being at its highest in 70 years. You know, as I said, 25 tax rises in this Parliament alone. And, you know, I think that really is the reason why, as I said, we can't go for that tax and spend lever. We want to go for that growth lever. And ultimately, you know, we would like taxes on working people to be lower, given how high the tax burden is right now. But that has to be done on the basis of fiscal and economic responsibility, because we saw what happened around this time last year when the government proposed tax cuts which were unfunded, you know, disrespecting the OBR and so on. We saw the damage that caused, not just to the economy at large, but to individual household finances. You know, people are still paying the price now in terms of mortgage payments and so on. So, you know, I think the tax burden, you know, is at its highest in 70 years. As I say, we would like the tax burden ultimately to be lower on working people, but that has to be on the basis of fiscal responsibility and economic stability, which really underpins everything that we put forward. On the point, as Andy, I think, was talking about high streets, you know, like I'm really interested to hear about, you know, your thinking about high streets, because from our point of view, you know, we want to make sure that the replacement for business rates would shift the burden to support high streets and more widely make sure that those online giants are paying their fair share. There's actually a piece of work that I've been doing over the last few years in this role around making sure that large multinationals pay their fair share, which is to do with the international deal on a global minimum rate of corporation tax and so on. And that's something we've been pushing the government on for a number of years. It is now, part of it is now in the process of being implemented, which we think is, you know, is good that is now happening. But it just shows how important it is, I think, to get a fair tax system to make sure that those large multinationals pay their fair share, not just to make sure that the UK exchequer gets their money, but also so that they don't undercut British businesses. So British businesses who do pay their fair share of tax, particularly those who have a high street presence, to make sure they are not undercut by multinationals who don't.
Paul, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, very briefly on each of those. Very important point about the structure of tax rates as well as the overall system of taxation. We will have many multiples of the number of higher rate taxpayers in a couple of years than we have ever had before. I think something like 1 in 6, up from about 1 in 20, 30 years ago. So the higher rate tax, 40p tax, is becoming the new basic rate. Above £100,000, where it goes to 60% and then 45%, we'll have the same number as we had 40% taxpayers 20 years ago. So that sort of over £100,000 level is the sort of new higher rate. And you've got absurd things here where if you've got a couple of kids and you're earning 99,000, you're better off not taking a tax pay rise until you get to about 130,000. I mean, that's how absurd the system is. So you do need to think about those things as well. It remains the case, actually, even with the 6-year freeze in the personal allowance, it's still going to be higher than it was in 2010. So we're still going to have a more income out of tax than we had back then. So there's some really difficult choices and trade-offs about levels of tax there. There's a very specific question about how quickly can you get growth. Well, you can force growth by sort of spending lots, but right now you've got an inflationary problem. You might be able to get growth going just by being a sensible, reasonable, rational, sort of stable kind of government. One of the things that has held back growth over the last decade has been that we haven't had a great deal of stability in anything. Another advert, I've got a radio program coming out at 8 o'clock this evening on Radio 4 about how to get growth. And every single person I spoke to, from business, from academia, from policymakers, said the most important thing we need for government, from government is stability and certainty. The CBI were much more worried about having a stable tax policy than they were about the exact level of corporation tax, for example. I'll stop there because I know we want to have more from James.
Ellen will sort of pick up a bit more possibly on the sort of digital services taxes and things later, but we are conscious of obviously trying to keep as many questions up in the, moving forward as well. So if we have another bank of questions, this lady here. Chris, where's the microphone? Sorry, this lady down here.
Thank you. It's Emily Ashton at Bloomberg. I just wanted to pick up on what Paul said about fuel duty and that kind of idea of how you replace fuel duty when electric vehicles take over. James, if you does Labour have any ideas on that?
And anyone, this gentleman behind her?
Zach Sharif, Citywire. The Conservatives are rumoured to have been scrapping inheritance tax, a feature we see a lot of them. But how will Labour handle inheritance tax? And how do we get to that simplicity that Ellen was talking about earlier?
And I'm conscious to this lady here and this gentleman at the front as well, just to sort of balance it up. The right seem to have got a lot of the questions at the moment.
Hello, it's Rachel Henry from Tax Justice UK. It's just a question going to how we get growth. And it seems that in some ways, a key mechanism for growth would potentially be rebuilding public services. It's difficult to imagine, that the UK is an attractive business environment at the moment with 7 million people on the NHS waiting list too ill to work. So I'm just interested in the panel's view on some of the sequencing of tax and spend and growth, and whether you might potentially need to tax and spend in order to get growth.
And this gentleman here, Chris.
Thanks. I'm Ollie from the Institute for Government. My question builds very much on that one. It's about growth in the public sector, so thinking particularly about public sector productivity. We heard a lot about that last week, so I guess my question is whether that's as much of a priority for Labour and how you'd go about doing it, whether you think spending more on capital, for example, is important to raising productivity, and I'd be interested in Paul's reflections on whether or not it's plausible or possible or achievable to get public service productivity up. Thanks.
James, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in terms of our, all our wider plans, we'll set them out in the run-up to the next general election. I mean, I think the point around inheritance tax, that was really some kind of rumour, I think, that came out of Conservative conference. And to be honest, they didn't even mention it at conference. So let's see what they say before we start speculating. I think, though, if I was just very quickly, because I'm getting signals from the person who's taking me out of the room, on the point around public services and around, I think there's actually your two questions link really interestingly together, because there is a question about, the immediate issues that we face and then the longer term issues. And the policies we set out this week about the NHS, I think, encapsulate this really, really well, in my opinion. So 1 in 7 people in England are on the waiting list. If we were elected, we'd want to get that waiting list down. So what we said we'd do is we would spend £1.1 billion of the money that we would raise by closing the non-dom tax loophole on 2 million extra appointments, scans, and tests every year. That would take a chunk out of that waiting list. But that's the sort of urgent response that we would need to do in government. What we'd actually need to do in terms of the wider public sector, I think linking to the second point, is about that reform and about making sure this is not just about putting more money into the system. As I said, there's that 1.1 billion we've identified as a sort of urgent response, but actually in the long term, that reform is really crucial. And I know Wes Streeting has spoken about, for instance, increasing the number of MRI and CT scanners across the NHS to really change the way the NHS works, take advantage of new technology, identify problems in people's health earlier, and that would really start to reform the NHS, make it fit for the future. So hopefully that kind of links those two questions together. And on that note, I'm going to have to dash, I'm afraid, but thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. See you later.
Okay, so we'll carry on. Paul, do you want to respond to some of those points?
I mean, actually, I'd like to respond to that point on the NHS and how much the extra billion would get you. I mean, let's get things in perspective. We spend 180 billion on the NHS, so an extra billion is a small amount. And an extra couple of million appointments sounds like a lot, but I'm reading from my book here. The scale of activity is staggering. The NHS carries out more than 10 million surgical procedures every year. They deal with 100 million outpatient appointments. There are 25 million GP appointments every month. So 2 million additional appointments on top of that is actually a small amount, which is what you'd expect, because 1 billion on top of 180 billion is a small amount. So I think it's important to get some of these things in perspective. In terms of the specific questions that were asked, public sector productivity is absolutely crucial, and actually particularly crucial in the health service. I've spoken to a number of heads of NHS trusts and so on, and you can see this in the data. NHS productivity has collapsed in the last 3 years since pre-COVID, and we don't really know why. So there are more people, a lot more people actually, there's more money, and it's doing less stuff. Now, the sorts of ideas or reasons that people think that might be happening is significantly to do with NHS staff disengagement and not doing the extra hour a day of unpaid overtime and so on that has been part of the way the NHS has run for a long time. But that is a huge problem. The reason we've got these big waiting lists is not the reason I expected. The reason I expected was that we had, I think, 15 million people didn't turn up during COVID to join waiting lists, and I kind of assumed that we get this big tsunami of people joining waiting lists. We haven't. What we've got, a similar number of people joining waiting lists, but a lot less activity. And that's just about unwinding at the moment. But that's and obviously made worse by strikes over the recent year. So productivity there, and I don't begin to pretend to have the answer to it, but it's certainly a key part of the problem. On inheritance tax, one of my colleagues who's here, I think, now has done a lot of work on that. One of the key things about inheritance tax is that because the older generation is so much wealthier, getting wealthier, we would expect more inheritance tax over time, possibly even doubling over the next decade or so. So quite expensive to get rid of it, irrespective of any impact on fairness or intergenerational inequity. There are some obvious loopholes in inheritance tax you might want to close. The fact there's no inheritance tax on pension pots seems to me to be completely mad. What's the best use of a pension? Leaving it to your children. That's not what pensions are for. The sort of fact that you can put money in the AIM investment market and pay no inheritance tax is crackers. So there are very easy and sensible and obvious things to sort out there. And I've already said what I said on fuel duty. We have to move to something like a charge per mile driven. But I'd be surprised if I see that in anyone's manifesto.
Thanks, Paul. Now, Ellen, you've been quiet up until now, so do you want to give us some thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'm probably not going to answer all 10 questions in one go, but there was one thing that I was kind of noting through a common theme of quite a lot of them, is that for me, listening to Paul then, there's a lot of data out there that sort of says, well, we've got this going on and we've got that going on and we've got the other going on. And when he was saying, well, actually the cause of these things is, the NHS productivity wasn't what he's expected. Certainly some of the stuff we've been challenging HMRC on seeing in the tax system is how can we better understand what is causing the problem. So I think without answering the question specifically, I would really advocate that we have some much better concerted data analysis within government about what is actually causing the problems that we're seeing through, why is it, going back to the customer service levels, why is it that we can't see people getting through on the phone? Why is it that productivity in the NHS, one of my closest friends is an anaesthetist, and you speak to her and she's like, well, actually I couldn't do the operations today because the recuperation room was having to be used for extra beds for people in the hospital. Well, that's not showing up on any of the kind of causes. So I think probably in a lot of these, for me, there's something about how can we get better at government looking at the data and seeing what the problems are that's actually stopping people accessing digital services, doing what they need, understanding what's driving people to change their approach on inheritance tax and things like that, because I think there could be some real wins there to actually solving the specific problems that we're facing.
Really interesting. Have we got any more questions on this side of the room? This gentleman here, Chris?
So may I just ask about national insurance, because it's not something that's been mentioned. And it seems that for working families, in that first kind of tranche of payment, it's at 12%, and then it drops to 2%. And that seems disproportionate in terms of the difference. So I want to understand whether there's a reason behind that, and if so, could it be reset? And then kind of a second part, if those people on the lower salaries paid less, that would obviously put more money in their pocket, but not necessarily increase costs to an employer, if that makes sense. Is there a play-off there in terms of inflationary pressures or not?
Thank you. And the one behind, Chris? I think there was a gentleman behind. Is it who else had their hand up? There's a sort of hand up. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks very much. In fact, Jim Mackenzie, Leith CLP. We know that the UK is the most unequal country in the developed world. Have you got any actually solutions how we can tackle that problem, including a wealth tax? Thanks.
Paul, do you want to respond to those 2 points?
Okay, yeah, national insurance, really important point. I mean, national insurance is, let's be clear, just a tax. There is no relationship between national insurance and anything in any way, form or shape that is different from income tax. So I think the priority for national insurance, when you think about the way things work, is that the result is that if you earn your income by renting out a property or living off the stock market, you don't pay national insurance, whereas if, like us, you're a wage slave, you do. And that effectively means that income tax on earnings is higher than income tax on unearned income, and that's not sensible. So, if I was a benign dictator, I would, for example, be announcing the imposition of national insurance contributions at an initially low but then rising level on occupational pensions in payment. Now, no one's going to vote for that, but that would be the right and appropriate thing to do. So that I think is the fundamental issue with national insurance. Now, in terms of the point that you were making, I think the other point is that actually that the existence of national insurance contributions gives me a big incentive, if I can, to become self-employed, or even better, to incorporate myself rather than being an employee. Again, creating lots of complication and unfairness. The particular point you ask is it starts at 12% and then goes down to 2%. But of course, the result is that the overall tax, ignoring employer, national insurance, goes from 32 to 42. And you can pick your choice about whether you think it should be 32 to 45 or 30 to 41. But you need to think about national insurance and income tax in the same breath when you're doing that. In terms of inequality, we are an unusually unequal country, particularly in terms of income, though not the most unequal. The US, I think, takes that particular accolade. My sense is that so some of that is to do with the fact that our out-of-work benefit system is pretty mean, much meaner than it is in most European countries. A lot of it is to do with the way the labour market works rather than the way that the tax system works. So part of the reason we're unequal is we suck lots of people into the City of London, where salaries are extremely high relative to anywhere else. That's a good thing in some ways. 1% of people pay 30% of income tax, so that's quite helpful for the public finances. The area where I think the tax system doesn't work is the taxation of wealth. So we've talked briefly about council tax, where you can live in a £100 million house in Westminster and pay a couple of grand in council tax, a much smaller fraction of your house value than if you live in a terraced house in Hartlepool. That's ridiculous. Capital gains tax, which has got a whole series of loopholes. Not least, you just don't pay it at all if you hold on to stuff until you die. That's both unfair and very inefficient. Inheritance tax we've talked about, so you can certainly do some things in those dimensions. But I think my overall feeling about tackling inequality is you need to do this in a very broad-based way. It starts early, so you need to focus on education and early years. You need to focus on 16 to 19 education. Particularly, you need to focus on labour market regulation and some of the things that we've heard being spoken about, and tax and welfare as well, but not tax and welfare centrally.
Thanks, Paul. Ellen, do you want to come back on any of those points?
So that was quite a comprehensive response, Paul. But I think in terms, for me, around the challenges with NICs and NICs and income tax is the sheer scale of them compared to the other taxes that we have. As soon as you start tweaking on the margins, the impact on the amount of money that actually comes in is massive. So you need a really solid foundation on which any government is going to take a risk on. That I think is one of the things that I've seen. So my background is corporate taxes. We spent an awful lot of time playing around with corporate taxes, but when you look at the size of them compared to the national insurance and the income tax, we probably could have just left corporate taxes alone. It doesn't help the guy who has his business rates problem on his high street, but equally, the impact there. So that would be the bit that I would be thinking around. What do we do with national insurance? Well, you've got to look at the scale of it to work out, is it going to impact, the little bit on one person? How much is that going to actually change the amount of money that comes in overall? In terms of wealth taxes, well, I think we could probably have an entire debate today on wealth taxes, and the other thing that I think comes into that as well is some of the levelling up. So you might have to earn an awful lot. You might have a very expensive house in one part of the country, but you've got to earn a lot. It might be a tiny, tiny little house compared to the thing that, it might be a little one-bed flat. And so if you start taxing that person, again, it adds a whole plethora of dynamics into it. But I think your response was fairly detailed, Paul, so I'll pause there.
Before we move on to the next question, I just want to sort of almost, while I've got Paul and Ellen together, the gentleman, I think, I'm not sure he's still here, asked about sort of digital services tax and taxation on sort of large tech companies. One of the things I'm quite interested to both of you is that the proposals, the OECD proposals, are all really at quite high income thresholds for these companies. Has any work been done as to what impact that will have, or are the income levels almost being set too high? Paul, I'll give it to you first.
I'm not across the latest proposals on that, I think it's fair to say. I mean, one thing I would say on business rates, which was where the original question came from, is I think business rates need reform. The way they change occasionally by big amounts is damaging. And I think the way that they are based on the value of the overall property paid by the occupant leads to lots of problems in terms of both their impact but also their perceived impact. If we were to move to a land value tax of businesses paid by the owner, I think that would make quite a significant difference to the perceived impact. The worry I have about cutting business rates is that in the end, the winner from that is the owner of the land, not necessarily the person renting the property on the land. In the end, it's the land that bears the tax. So in the short run, it will feel to a business, and it will be true in the short run, that cutting business rates will make them worse off. But in the long run, it will result in the rent on that property going up.
Yeah,
Thank you, Paul. Sorry.
Just jumping in there now, Gary. Yeah, it's a really interesting point there, Paul, around the business rates, and it's not something I've particularly done a lot with on business rates. I think going back to the kind of the digital services tax point, obviously we have a digital services tax in the UK. I think in the 1 year it was charged on 18 businesses, which for £350 million came in from those. So it's an interesting thing because actually in the grand scheme of things, that's not that much money. So, what do you do with that? It's not going to suddenly, I tried to look up how much a hospital costs to build. I can tell you it was a whole range. I'm not sure how many hospitals, probably not very many, but it's not going to change the world. So what are we trying to do with the digital services tax? Obviously, it's going to be taken away if all of the European OECD work comes through to where it thinks we've committed to it being removed again. But that also brings back the fact that a lot of what we're doing in the digital space is to do with the global collaboration as well and working. So whilst the stuff that's in our power to change, actually getting that global cooperation is going to be really important to solving the problem. It just doesn't help us with the short-term solutions around the business rates and things which kind of feed into it. So there's loads of work going to continue in there. We mentioned the 15% earlier. That now looks like, it's all going to be implemented. We're still in a problem where we've got the US not moving on the other half of the pillars work. I do think, however, it's going to show a trend where we're going to see more with the global world. We're going to see more of these things, more of this tax policy where we're going to need to be influenced across borders. So one of the big changes that we've seen out of since the pandemic is workers are now much more likely to move around. And so, at the moment, you can tax a person on their income and they get their benefits where they are, where they're working. I think one of the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of tax policy in the future is how does this global collaboration help solve some of those problems. So I think it could shift how we think about tax policy and how we get ahead so that we don't end up with the next business rates thing, which is anchored down inside the UK tax system.
It's a very interesting point, actually. Is there any more questions? I'm keen to this lady here. Sorry, Chris. Oh, the lady at the back first, then we'll come across.
Hi, Hannah Miller, BBC News. The Conservative Party's attack line today is about Rachel Reeves not mentioning inflation, particularly given the borrowing for green investment that the party has planned. Given where the economy is likely to be in May or October next year, how significant a concern do you think that that is?
And any more around that way? Otherwise, we'll come across this side, Chris, and get a couple more in. This lady first here.
So today Rachel Reeves talked about Labour being the party of home ownership. Is there any scope around capital gains tax where you have accidental landlords who are falling into the capital gains trap when their mortgages are going up, and Labour could potentially release them from that obligation, providing more housing supply into the market? Because obviously there's these huge pressures on building. So I wonder whether there's something around that might make it attractive, and there might be a perception that Labour actually is also a party of giving people a tax break.
Interesting. And the one man behind? Oh, sorry, this gentleman. Oh, either of you.
Sorry. So you've talked quite a lot about raising more money from taxation. But with the developments in automation, AI, robotics, we are going to find in years and decades ahead that humans are competing with machines for jobs. Also the geographical fragmentation of knowledge jobs that you've talked about. Is it tenable to continue to tax jobs at 13.8%, employers' national insurance contributions, and balance that competition between people and machines for jobs?
Okay, we'll respond to those in a second. So this man will be next, Chris, and then the gentleman behind that gentleman as well. Paul, do you want to go ahead with some of that?
Yeah, sure. So the question on inflation, we would expect, I think, inflation come this time next year to be significantly below where it is now. But we're not in a world which we've been in for quite some time before now, where we couldn't exactly ignore inflation. We could be reasonably confident that it was going to be staying really quite low. So inflation is going to remain an issue for a period of time, not least because the expectations in the market, at least, are that interest rates are going to stay pretty high, around about where they are now, for quite some period of time. And anything that puts an upward pressure on inflation is going to make interest rates stay at that higher level for a longer period of time. And significant extra borrowing would be one of the things which might have that impact. So that's that's one of the constraints that I think a government will have for the next few years, which actually certainly most over the period of the 2010s was much less of a constraint. And that higher inflation and in itself leads to higher interest rates and higher debt interest payments, which is one of the big problems that a government's going to be facing for some period of time as debt interest spending is so much higher. Now, on the you linked it to the green investment point. It is important to be clear that this current government has got investment by the public sector at essentially its highest level in modern times. So investment is pretty high now, but on government plans it's coming down quite sharply. On Labour plans, it still comes down from where it is now, just much less sharply than under current government plans. I think that is a really important sort of context to be clear about. On housing taxation, there's one change that I could make to housing taxation. It would be to abolish stamp duty or very dramatically reduce it. It is just a disastrous tax from every imaginable point of view. It reduces movement. It locks older people into big houses, makes it much harder for younger people to get into houses that they want. So rather than anything to do with capital gains on second houses. In terms of more money from taxation in the face of AI, I'm no expert on AI, but there is no evidence that it's going to reduce the total number of jobs in the economy.
Ellen, do you want to give us some views?
Some views. So I am not an expert on AI either, but it is certainly something we've been thinking about with our tax hats on in terms of what it does to our own industry. But I think it kind of ties back a little bit to my previous point, actually, which is around there's something that we need to do in the tax system about future-proofing. So we're seeing that. Similarly, we were talking very early on about the petrol cars. You know, I would love to get us to a place, or us to see a place where the tax was proactive rather than the changes were ready before rather than reactive. So we suddenly think, oh, that's dipped, and now we need to bring something on electric vehicles. So yes, is it? And then also you've got your income tax point. Where are people working? What are they doing? It could be an interesting question. It might be that we see a world, I don't know, where jobs are much higher paid in the future because the low-level jobs aren't. So then how does that skew your income tax? I don't know. But I do think it's something that's going to need a bit of watching over time. I think I'll leave the inflation point sitting next to a leading economist. You probably don't need anything further from me on that one.
We'll go to some more questions in a second, but in terms of digital economy and AI, I mean, one of the things, I sort of do, you know, bits and pieces in the area, and obviously one of the conversations at the moment, or all the conversations, seems to be around generative AI at the moment. There was a point of time, if I was speaking to people probably 2 years ago, we would have all been possibly talking about robots rather than AI, and actually I think, you know, there's policy issues around robots, whether it's AI, whether it's robots, I think are particularly interesting because, you know, if you look at a lot of tax policy and what is a person and what are the, you know, who's responsible for an act, you know, whether it's a criminal act or a taxation act, you know, how do you tax a robot, and particularly a robot that then it has theoretically a mind of its own. So there's some interesting points in there. This gentleman here, do you want to give us a question?
Oh, hello, thank you. My name's David Oakinson. I'm a delegate here to this conference, and I'm a chartered accountant, and I've worked a lot in tax, so I understand all the technical points that are made. And I just wonder if these debates are, in a sense, too technical about tax and not enough about social attitudes. You know, because I see in my work, and I also see in just general life, people are very selfish about tax. A lot of this has been about, how do I personally pay less tax? People want the health service, but they don't want to pay for it. Wealthy people want a defence force that protects them from aggression, but they don't want to pay for it. People don't want their houses burgled, but they don't want to pay for the police service. And I wonder if instead of trying to dance around, trying to pick a bit more from here and a bit more from there, we should maybe be a bit more Scandinavian about it and recognise we do actually have to pay. And instead of hiding it with ideas of economic growth that doesn't hurt anybody, we just generally have to pay more. Those of us that can afford it pay more so that we can get the services. We aren't just sitting here being selfish, asking nurses and doctors to be altruistic, but we should maybe say, let's all join in and be maybe a bit socialist about it. But that's an argument for the politicians. So really what I'm saying is, rather than the whole technical thing, which to me is very interesting, is there an argument to put to the Labour Party, and perhaps we're missing the person we should be saying this to, that we should stand up and say, tax is good, what we do with it is something that we're proud of, and let's go for it.
And there's this man behind the one in the purple jumper, Chris. There is something around citizenship, and there is a discussion that should be had around citizenship. I think people, you know, there is that sort of cultural issue as to whether, you know, are you proud to pay tax?
Forgive me if this is a little simplistic. I'm only an ordinary member, but it seems to me that we've got quite literally the public estate falling down. We've got a massive problem in recruiting public sector workers and a bigger problem retaining them. All these things require pretty immediate spending. Yet it seems likely that extra revenues from growth aren't really going to be coming online until 2 or 3 years into a parliament. So perhaps I'm being, again, negative, but it seems to me that all we seem to have to fill this gap is a little bit of fiscal drag and an awful lot of platitudes. You know, how do we fill that gap for the first 2 years?
I think there's one, there's this lady here actually, Chris.
Hi, Erin Mansell from the Women's Budget Group. Just picking up on that point about productivity and public services, how much of that is kind of linked to the gendered impact on, you know, women's labour market participation rates, given that we know the majority of NHS workers are women, and I think 1 in 3 NHS workers have some unpaid care responsibilities. So without kind of addressing social care and childcare collapse, kind of how do you increase that productivity?
Ellen, do you want to swap it around? Do you want to start this time? Actually?
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, I'll start by picking up on the gentleman at the front point, because I think it's quite an interesting thing here for me around. So we ran a survey in the summer at CIOT, and one of the questions was around trust in the tax system. And I think because people feel like they've been dealt quite a poor hand, or they get frustrated when they try and do things correctly, 98% of them had sort of a negative response about trust in the tax system. And I think there's a really critical point there, that if you are going to get the goodwill of people to say, yes, I want to be part of this, there also has to be trust that that money is not only going to be handled correctly and that they can work with it, but it's going to go to the right place. So I think it's more than just I want to pay some money, or everybody should feel part of this social contract, because I think unfortunately the starting point that we're in is that we've got to rebuild that reputation and that trust in the tax system itself. But yes, absolutely, I'm completely on board with you that, you know, the money's got to come from somewhere. And I think I said in my opener, everybody wants everybody else to pay the tax, but until you believe that you're paying your fair share, it's very hard from a kind of behavioural science point of view to believe that somebody else is also paying their fair share and everybody else, and then we're all in it together. Whereas as soon as you see your next door neighbour building his swimming pool, and you know, it breaks it down. So yes, I think very interesting, but I do think that the starting point would actually be having to rebuild that trust in what we're doing. The gender question is so complicated, but yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, law started from being written by men, didn't it? I remember my jurisprudence at university around, is law designed by men, therefore male inherently? Really, really difficult. I think there are some proper workforce questions around, you know, and I think actually there's an outcome of the pandemic has also been that people are opening their eyes up to say, yes, I can work flexibly, yes, I can do these things, but yes, it would be a really interesting area, I think, for any government to look at to see how you can get that productivity back into the workforce. And I think it relates back to your point about the NHS as well. So in terms of, you know, why are people no longer wanting to do the really long hours? And actually, is it that just half of them are burnt out? I don't know. Or is it that they've realised that enough's enough, you can't do it anymore? So, and then I can't recall what the last question was, I'm afraid. So I might hand that one to Paul, whatever it was.
Well, we're almost out of time anyway, and I've really enjoyed this debate, but I'd be really keen just to almost in winding things up. If Paul, if you want to give us maybe respond to Ellen, but you know, a couple of minutes to finish off, and then put Ellen maybe a minute for you to finish off as well.
Well, I always wanted to offer a sort of slightly philosophical response to there were two questions really about shouldn't people be happy to pay their fair share of tax. And one of the problems seriously is determining what that fair share is given the way our tax system works. There was a chap on Question Time a year or two ago who sort of said that I earn 60,000 a year, I'm not rich, and the whole audience went bonkers saying, yes, you are rich, you earn a lot more than I do. Well, if you're in your 50s and you've paid off your mortgage or you've inherited something and you haven't got any kids, then yeah, you probably are quite rich. But if you're in your 30s and you've got no inheritance, you've got a big mortgage and you've got a couple of kids and your partner doesn't work, then you're really not rich. So actually simply determining, I think one of the genuine issues is that simply determining your tax liability by your current earnings is not actually a brilliant way of determining how well off you are, how capable you are of paying that tax. And I think that is a serious issue, and one that can be addressed by various aspects of the tax system, including the way that we tax savings and including the way that we tax debt. So I think we do need to think about that quite seriously. I mean, in that, all of that said, clearly we have a choice about whether we tax more and spend more or tax less and spend less. One of the things, I've been at a couple of fringes now. One of the things that worries me is that there's still a little bit of a sort of sense that if we define borrowing a bit differently, or if we define the fiscal rules a bit differently, or if we counted education spending as capital spending, then we could have higher spending without higher taxes. Well, in the long run, you can't. I mean, you just can't. I mean, if you want European-style services, then you need European-style tax. And if you want American-style tax, then you need American-style services. And in the end, that is the choice. And fiddling around with all the other stuff isn't going to get there. Actually, the gentleman also said something else which was interesting, which is growth doesn't hurt anyone. I think one of the reasons we don't have pro-growth policies is that they can hurt people and they can shout very, very, very loudly. So a pro-growth policy is to build more roads and airports. If they build them through your back garden, that really does hurt you, and it might not be very many people who get hurt, but they tend to be very loud indeed. Now, that's a very extreme example, but I think that's one of the reasons why planning policy, which I'm very pleased to hear Rachel Reeves saying she wants to significantly reform, but the reason it hasn't been reformed for decades in any serious way is that it's very unpopular among some people that it affects. So that's why politics is difficult, and it's a genuine issue. In terms of women's labour market participation and earnings, there are a series of issues here. And one thing that we have done with our welfare system is design it in such a way that it's much more necessary or valuable, or pushed it. Women, lone parents particularly, are pushed into work much more than they used to be. But they have been exclusively pushed into low-paid part-time work, which offers no long-term benefit at all, either to them or the taxpayer, actually. And one of the problems with our labour market is that part-time work is about as valuable as not working at all in terms of your future earnings. And of course, the vast majority of people in part-time work are women. So there's something wrong with the way that the labour market works. There's something wrong with the way the welfare system works because of the way that it disincentivises full-time work. And it is also related actually to lack of transport and connectivity, because if you want to work only, say, 10 till 3 or something to fit in with the school pickup, then that really, really limits how far you can travel to go to work. So I'm not sure that tax is the biggest issue here, but I do think welfare, I do think the way the labour market works, and I do actually think things like transport system are really important.
Thanks, Paul. Transport is indeed important. Ellen, do you want to give us the last couple of seconds?
Yeah, so I think we very much opened up with the uplifting statements from Paul about, what a great state we were in, and I definitely feel like, we've obviously chewed around some of the challenges that we're going to face with that today. I think one of the very, very welcome statements from me from James Murray was the fact that there's going to be some kind of business tax roadmap, because that is something I've been wanting to put on our list of desirables for a long time. I think it would be absolutely brilliant if we could go into the next Parliament with a really clear direction. Admittedly, it would have to be kept to, other than in exceptional circumstances, but I think there is some big case. I'm going to finish with 2 words, which are certainty and stability, and I'll finish with that. Thank you.
Important words indeed. So thank you very much for staying with us through the debate. I certainly found it particularly interesting. The fact that you're all still here suggests to me that hopefully you found it quite interesting as well. I'd love to thank Paul, as always, for amazing contributions. Very thought-provoking. Of course, I would thank Ellen. She's a partner colleague of mine at the Chartered Institute of Tax, Director of Public Policy. Thank you very much for your contribution as well. And obviously, he's no longer in the room, but thank you very much to James Murray, as always, for his time in any of the events that we all participate in. So thank you very much for all of you for staying with us today. I hope you have a great end of the conference. Thank you.
Just to add, we still have some pastries over there, not to mention glasses of wine and teas and coffees. We've still got the room for a few minutes, so if anybody